we are. When I finished the HOG bike, I was definitely very enthusiastic about how it turned out, and immediately a lot of people started asking me, what's your favorite bike now? You know, I had the Royal Enfield for a little over a year, got about 11,500 miles on it, and just as coincidence goes, I had to do some work on the Enfield, put on a new back tire, which meant it was like out of commission for about a week. We were quite busy with work, so I actually had to take the HOG to work every day. So I really had like a good bit of fun on this bike every day, you know, going back and forth a distance of 22 kilometers each way, taking me most of the time on the motorway, on our Irish M50, where maximum speed is 120. But yeah, you know, if you see a gap, you try to do a little bit more than that. Cheeky, especially on a bike like this, that is just very inviting to do that. I've often looked at this bike and, you know, kind of like jokingly said, like, this is either the type of bike that a first-time rider will appeal to, but also, you know, the good old midlife crisis 55 plus biker, you know, being a little bit more sedated, or even just like getting onto a motorcycle for the first time, might find this much more alluring than this. To start out, a lot of people, when I announced I was going to do a face-off between the two bikes, a lot of people immediately flagged one of the two bikes as saying, this is going to be a win. There is no contest here. Is it really that clear? Well, let's have a look. Let's go over some like specifications and some background before we actually get into both bikes. Let's start with weight. 194 kilograms coming out of the factory, 207 coming out of the factory. Okay. The Enfield is a little bit heavier now. I would say I put it around 200. We've got the panniers on it, we've got the ammo box on it, a few bits and bobs that went onto the bike as performance enhancers. So let's call this an even 200 kilograms. The HOG bike, man, I took an angle grinder to that thing like there was no tomorrow. So I would say that the HOG at the moment is lighter than the Royal Enfield. It's going to be around the 190s. So yeah, let's keep it that they're both same weight, give a couple of pounds. Now, age is a factor. Okay. So I bought the Royal Enfield brand new last year in May. So yeah, that is basically a brand new bike, but it's based on a model that's been produced since 1958 with very few changes to it. On this side we have the HOG bike. It's 20 years old. It's been definitely being driven, 15 of it at approximately 20,000 kilometers per year. This thing has clocked 250,000 kilometers already. So it is like, is it an age battle or isn't it? Those are things to keep in consideration. Another thing to keep in consideration, that both these bikes lack what you see in modern bikes, like things like traction control, computers that adjust your ABS while you're taking a turn. All these things, all these electronic hee-haws that supposed to make you a safer rider, but according to me, it's taking all the fun out of it. So that's where we are when it comes to these two bikes. All right, what's next? How much would you pay for them brand new? This one will be around 10,000 euros. This one 7,000, but that was like in 2001, and this was like in 2019. So I don't know how much you would pay for a brand new Marauder. These bikes came up around 2000, where there was like some interest in the mid-class cruisers. And when I mean mid-class, I'm talking about engines between 650 and 800cc. So this is an 800cc V-twin. Coming out of the factory, it's 50 brake horsepower. We did some tweaks on it, so let's just call it 60. Coming out of the factory, the Royal Enfield, 27 brake horsepower. Okay, some modifications done, but I wouldn't even give it more than 30. But the modifications weren't really about giving it more horsepower. So, coming out of the gate, this one has twice the brake horsepower as this one. Just the still thing, it's an easy win for the HOG. Not exactly. This bike is a lot of fun. What you want is a dry day and get out there and just burn some rubber. The way this thing accelerates, it just leaves the Royal Enfield behind. Especially on the motorway, this is the bike you want to be on, unless it's wet. The rear end gets a bit slippery, and that's just because, like I did all the modifications, this bike is always a bit tricky in wet weather, so you really want to watch that throttle in the roundabout. You don't have that power traction control on this bike, which basically means you need to learn your bike and you need to know when to open up this throttle and when you don't. So, with that in account, right, it brought me to work quite quickly. I had some dry days where I had a lot of fun. Passing cars on the motorway was no problem at all. But the wet days, I really had to be careful. As in being nimble, I do find that I compare this bike to the Royal Enfield. In slow moving traffic or going through town, yeah, you work a little bit harder on this one. Brakes are okay. Suspension, not that much. Although it's like put down quite stiff. On the motorway, it's fine. You get a lot of feedback from the road, which is good, which is what you need. Going through the countryside, you know, where you got like quite a bit of debris and potholes. Yeah, the bike tends to punish you for that. So that is something countryside roads this bike is not really good at. Another thing this bike is really good at is consuming fuel. It is, compared to Royal Enfield, it is horrendous. Out of the Royal Enfield, I get like the tanks are similar. I put about 60 euros of fuel in both of them to fill them up. Going back and forward to work, the HOG will last me 2 days. The Royal Enfield will last me a whole week. So driving it around, it's a little bit more expensive. Also, what's a little bit more expensive is when you need new tires. This bike demands good tires. I mean, it's not like a super powerful bike, but you know, if you're going to utilize that power, you want to have like good contact to the wheel. So I didn't get to go for the cheap tires. I went for Continental tires. They are the recommended cruiser tires for these bikes. Really happy with them. I had a different type of tire before them that I used a lot because they were like cheaper, and that made the bike really horrendous in wet weather. So having these tires on the bike kind of like brought this bike, you know, a little bit more comfort in driving in wet weather. Although you tend to be a lot more careful with the throttle because there's the risk of slipping out, especially pulling away from traffic lights in wet weather. This bike, you know, tends to spin it around a bit if you give it too much heft. Quite, you know, challenging to keep that under control when there is like a car looking at you and revving and, you know, wants to see like who's got the most muscle. Most of the time you do, but it's the contact on the road, so leave that stuff for dry days. In terms of comfort, this is a really comfortable bike. Definitely the seat is a Mustang seat. It was specially designed for the Marauder. I've had it a couple of years. It made a huge difference with the standard seat. There's something about standard seats on motorbikes, they're always too hard. After half an hour, you know, like your arse starting to get wooden. I found that with this seat on, and I'm going to go long distances. Yes, I can stay in the saddle like for like 2 hours in a row before I really need to make a rest stop. Hey, I'm an old man. Okay, what else? Reliability. Okay, so like I've ridden this bike about 15 years, and most of the time the only maintenance was needed was just setting the valves once a year, changing the oil once a year, of course a new oil filter once a year, and then I would go through a set of tires once a year as well. So that would like put my full maintenance schedule around €500 to keep this bike on the road for a year in maintenance. Occasionally sprocket and change, usually once every 2 years, 3 years. I'm probably going to run through them a little bit faster now, but yeah, who knows. But that's basically it. Like on average, it took me like €600 a year to keep this one, you know, on the road in proper condition, in a safe condition. Other than that, in terms of failures, I had, I can't even remember I had like a serious failure. One time I was by the side of the road because the engine completely died on me. It turned out to be something simple. There was a connector under the saddle that had a couple of snapped it back in, and off my way I went again. It has been a very good bike, and like I said, like for 15 years, it brought me everywhere I wanted to go without too much hassle. So that's it really for the Marauder. The first motorbike I ever owned was a Royal Enfield Bullet 350. It looked exactly the same as this, apart from a few things. But that was like 30 years ago. So the Royal Enfield for me is like a lot of emotional stuff with this. It was like the start of me driving motorcycles. Another part of it that eventually that old 350 went to my dad and he drove it for some time as well. So when I was basically looking for a new bike, I came across the Royal Enfield, and I remember the times that I had with it, and I was like kind of in dubio because I loved the model, I loved the handling of it. It was way beyond its years in road handling. It wasn't really that reliable, to be honest, but again, to be honest, I think the previous owner didn't give it a lot of good care. So I had to like fix and undo a lot of negligence when I owned that bike. I had it about like 3 or 4 years, when I switched to a Suzuki 600 Savage, which was also a lovely bike. But coming back full circle to the Royal Enfield, it's not an expensive bike, and it's not expensive to maintain. Like a rear tire on the HOG bike, that will set me back 230 euros. This one I just had replaced 130 euros. You know, if you're not like filthy rich, that makes a difference. That's money I can spend on other things, like fixing up a bike. It comes really very complete for the 7,000 euros I paid on it and some change. I got the panniers on it. It's not a very powerful bike, like I said, 27 horsepower, 108 horsepower, maybe 30 with the modifications I did. But what makes this so special, and what makes this give the HOG bike a run for its money? Number one, brakes. The brakes on this bike are absolutely fabulous. And remember I said, like, they are the same weight. And you can argue, well, you wouldn't go as fast, you know, on the Enfield as you would go on the Marauder. Look, if you go, while you're on the motorway doing 120 on this bike or that bike, you can tell the difference between how you apply the brakes. Having said that, the new model, or at least this model, comes with ABS brakes. That's what the original product didn't have. But to tell you honestly, to tell you the truth, I think I only once engaged the ABS system on this bike, and that's when I had to make like a real emergency stop from somebody swinging out a side street without looking. And that probably saved my life. But other than that, I hardly engage the ABS brakes. They're good brakes, they're really reliable, and in combination with something that this bike definitely has over the HOG bike, is road handling. It is superb. I really noticed it when I had back tire replaced and I could drive it around again to work again. I just noticed, like, going in and out of lanes on the motorway, taking those sharp turns in the exits, and just when traffic gets a little bit more busy in town, the Royal Enfield is so much more nimble on its feet than the HOG bike. Although they both classify cruisers, it kind of makes sense, because the rake of this fork is, you know, not as forward facing as the HOG bike. You know, it does make a difference in the handling, but also the suspension on this bike is just way better. It's not too soft, it's just right where it needs to be. You get like really good feedback from the road you're on. And most importantly, I love, in my spare time, I love going down those country roads. And I mentioned before, potholes, gravel, dirt, they pop up whenever you don't expect them. And, you know, on the HOG, you know, I will have like a couple of brown moments when that happens, where I feel the back sliding off because of some gravel that I didn't spot in a turn. The Royal Enfield just doesn't budge. There is one road that we call the Sally's Gap, a very popular road in Ireland, and I love taking pleasure on that road because it's so windy, it's so twisty, it's in all different sorts of conditions, and you can really pace the bike through its motions on that road. You know, speed is not going to be an advantage. A huge amount of horsepower is not going to be an advantage. What your advantage is how the bike handles, how it just sticks to the road, how well the brakes work, and that is just where the Royal Enfield just shines. People on more powerful bikes really have to work hard to keep up, and that's just because of the superb road handling. It sounds strange, that this bike is so well at handling, because it's a model that is basically designed in 1958. The frame hasn't changed. The way the suspension worked hasn't changed. The only changes on this bike was they turned it into a UCE engine, meaning that the transmission is integral into the engine block. Before that, it was a separate piece that you just bolted on. Again, there's like the only change they made to this on the engine was the fuel injection. Fuck off, what? So those are actually two major changes. Everything else basically stayed the same. I mentioned the ABS disc brakes. The ABS got on there because it's a requirement of the European Union that all new bikes have ABS. You could have just left it off. I have to say, the disc brakes itself are a huge improvement on the original brakes from 1958, drum brakes. That was a different matter. I wouldn't praise those brakes as much as I would praise the newer models on it. As a matter of fact, they just stopped producing this model at Royal Enfield. There are just a few of them more for sale, but production has completely stopped. They're focusing on their 650 twin engine. It's also like, you know, they're targeting the mid-range of motorcyclists, and you know, they just have a greater market for this model, and a fantastic run since 1958. So I'm glad I grabbed one when I had a chance. Mentioned before, fuel consumption is very good. Driving it, right? First of all, like, one cylinder is going to have a lot more vibrations. It vibrates more than the HOG machine. If I'm going to be driving this for 2 hours straight, yeah, my hands will start to get a little bit numb. I did some modifications to it to reduce that a bit. So that worked pretty good with a Carberry anti-vibration plate. That took some of it away. And I haven't really been on long trips since I installed the plate, so maybe I should do one and see how far I can push it. But there is something about the Royal Enfield that you can't really explain by talking about statistics. It's, you get on a Royal Enfield and you do not have the power of the Marauder. You only have half, you know, like 27 brake horsepower. Let's just stick with the factory specifications there. But it doesn't matter, you don't care. The way that, like, you can get the bike onto the M50, probably you will be doing a less overtaking because you don't have like that huge reserve of power, but you don't feel inclined to do so because you're driving a Royal Enfield. And especially when you're taking the bike down country roads and you're taking it through turns and through all its paces, the one thing that just like pops into my mind is like, we don't make bikes like this anymore. Well, they do, obviously, there's one here, but it's a form of enjoyment of hearing that one cylinder puttering away. Some people comment like, the engine is noisy. I love it that the engine is noisy. I love to hear, you know, the tackets go tick, 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 tick. I love the thump that come out of it. The HOG bike is definitely a lot noisier. It's gloriously noisy, but I would imagine I haven't done a long trip on the HOG either, as it is now. But yeah, you would want to bring earplugs because your hearing will be gone after 2 hours. This Enfield is not a quiet bike either. It's got the Hitchcock muffler on it. It has a nice sound, but it's not overwhelming. It's just like, you know, enjoying the way. And that's it really. It's driving the Royal Enfield doesn't give you any room for stressing about. It's, you know, you have your destination, you get there when you get there. The enjoyment is not in the destination, and the enjoyment on the Royal Enfield is the journey. So they say life is a series of hard choices, and you know that is the question that has to end with a showdown between the HOG and Badger. If I was forced to give up one of these two bikes, which one? And I love this bike. It's been like a rejuvenation dream. It's got a lot of history behind it. It ties into the military, it ties into the memories of my father. On the other hand, we have the HOG bike here that's been with me for all this time. For 15 years I drove it 20,000 kilometers every year, so there's a lot of good memories in there as well. It basically comes down to practicality and summoning all things up. The bike that would stay would be the Royal Enfield, and that's basically the reality of where I live now. We've got a lot of range weather there. I use that bike every day. I would say half of the year I'm going to be driving through rain. Half of the year I'm going to be in front of slow traffic. Half of the year, if I want to go for a ride, conditions are not going to be perfectly dry, and yeah, I would miss the violence of this thing, because this is great. This is like, you know, like let it all out. I'm happy that I don't have to make that choice right now, because this is definitely going to be a bike that I'm going to keep ready and tuned, and you know, when that lovely dry weather comes out and I want to get rid of some of that testosterone flowing into my blood, this is the bike to do it. But for every day, it's the Royal Enfield, and it's, when we're talking about driving a bike for stress reduction, you cannot beat this thing. It stole my heart, and it's gotten its own soul. Both are fantastic bikes. I love them both. They both have value for me. One, especially the HOG one, for the artistic input that I've put into it. It turned out to be like a completely different bike than it originally was. But the Royal Enfield is just so much more than what is on specs. As if I talk with a lot of people who own a classic 500 as a second bike, and then I mean like their first bike would be the CZR 1100 or some completely overpowered machine, they will all say the same thing. It is so much more fun to drive a Royal Enfield Classic 500 than most of the bikes out there. Can you put your finger on it? Is it nostalgia? Is it, you know, usually guys in their 40s, 50s that are remembering times of bikes where you didn't have all these board computers, managing your brakes, managing, you know, all that stuff, where you just had to know your bike, know your limits and the bike limits. And this bike is pretty much the same. It's like you need to know the limits, but the feeling is, while this is a less powerful bike, it shines more, it does more with what it has, and especially into the country roads, it's a beautiful thing. So, HOG versus Badger, who wins? Badger. Sorry bro, but I just gotta keep it 100. Alright, thank you, see you next time.